We bought AutoAlex's S2000, and in the last 3 episodes, we chopped it up to try and turn it into a race car. We decided to go with carbon over fenders because, let's be honest, not even Jesus could save these arches.
Seen better days, we might actually be able to repair this.
I don't know. Okay.
Oh, there you go.
There we go.
Hey.
Right. Now, some of our viewers thought we were absolutely mental for doing this first rather than going for, the important things. Like, us not even having a third gear. But the fact is, our subframe and suspension components look like they've been recovered from the Titanic, which means we're going to be replacing them. And since we're going wide body with the car, we need to know exactly how wide so we can order the correct wheels and suspension components in order to make it work. The issue is, however, these parts take time to be manufactured and sent to us. And since we've got some spare time before those arrive, I came up with a stupid idea. Right, Mark. We've cut the arches off the car. We've got the carbon arches on.
Yep, front bumper fitted.
It's coming along.
It's moving at a nice pace.
So we need to decide what the next step is. We've ordered some new suspension components.
Yep.
Every nut, bolt, washer, every bush,
Aye.
everything to replace the whole underside of the
Yep,
car.
we're really going to town with the underside.
Yeah. We don't actually have anything to do on the car for the next 3 weeks.
Well, there's plenty to do.
We just don't have parts for it.
We just don't have parts, aye.
So, how about in 3 weeks' time, we've got Festival of Motorsport here in Scotland, and I know we've got a few cars already going, but how about we take one more?
What, the S2000?
But not in the condition that it's in.
Right. Oh, you want to put it out till we get it wrapped or something?
I think we paint it.
In 3 weeks?
3 weeks.
Aye, no bother. Aye. Why not? What's the worst that can happen?
So a deadline with 3 weeks.
3 weeks.
That means we're going to have to bring on a cameraman. And I can think of no man better than our boy Stephen.
Stefan.
Slide on top, yes. This is Stephen, and he's a very close friend of mine. Not that close, if you know what I mean. But if we're going to spray this car from his crusty old blue colour into something much more special, we are going to need some help, especially with a 3-week deadline and lots of welding. First things first though, while we wait on our welder, we get to do the satisfying job of rubbing all the old paint off with a sander. The reason why we're doing this step first is to see if this car has any previous crimes, i.e. body filler, that we'll need to weld actual metal material in to make a good job of it. This step will also help us discover little bumps and dents that otherwise we wouldn't have been able to see. That way we can identify what needs to be done in order to give this thing a really nice paint finish. Of course, it didn't take us long to discover this nasty stone chip on the front wing, and if you remember episode 2, this is what remains of the gigantic scratch that went along the whole entire side of the car. Kinda reminds me of the mattress stains you'd leave as a teenager. Once Marc's done with the sander, I go over it with some Scotch-Brite to make sure every single surface on this panel is keyed. This makes sure the surface is rough enough that the primer can take a good hold and make sure it doesn't peel off. Our passenger wing had some nasty damage just above the headlight, so Marc cleans up the surface of it to give us another couple of hours pain trying to set that straight later. With the exception of the front bumper, the front end is almost done. Well, if it wasn't for me messing around with Marc's emotions.
It's not damaged that bad, but come on.
Oh no, do we need to buy a new bit?
No, don't do that.
Jim at Tegla. Windscreen seal.
Yeah, sand that rocker cover.
I know.
Seen better days.
Another back radiator.
No.
You're a Scotsman, Scots bright. What do you expect that?
I don't have ring, I've got enough density.
Next up, we remove the bonnet so we can degrease it and obviously sand the underside of it too, but not before I ruin more things with my Scotch-Brite. As Marc starts doing the door skins, we discover more cardinal sins, probably committed by someone in a Nissan Qashqai in an Asda car park. Just yet more things to fix in under 3 weeks. I moved on to some weight reduction, which ironically exposed the cleanest part of the car. Then of course immediately got involved in destroying it with some Scotch-Brite, and then some other things. Now this quick cut montage probably makes things look easy, but just cleaning this alone took over an hour. So just imagine the almost entire week it took 3 guys after their shifts of work to come along here and start buzzing bits of car off. With the amount of time and effort Marc had spent in sanding the entire car, he was understandably upset about what I'd done to his rubber window seal, so I decided to offer him a solution. Okay, just do the whole thing and even it up.
Day 5. Jamie's still standing in the bonnet. Can't feel my fingers.
No fingers left.
Just trying to do my fingerprints. I'm just trying to get in all these small gaps where the sander won't get to. Forgot to speak in my YouTube accent.
The microphone hearing voice.
Yes. With both sides of the bonnet finally done, and we're replacing this with a carbon fibre one by the way, we just have the boot lid to go, and then it's time to weld.
We need a new brake light.
Shut up. I'm not touching this car ever again. I'll just be the editor, right? If the surgeon was Harold shit.
Missed a pinnacle moment there. Jamie got something out about breaking it.
I don't know about that.
Oh, no, it's really broken. Just remember to ask Jim at Tegwa that we need a clip for every panel on this car.
What, the boring one at the fucking... Oh, cock. So after one too many rows from Dad, it's time for me to Scotch-Brite this boot lid while Mario gets welding. Because the arches on the S2000 are double skinned, that means there's an inside skin and an outside skin. Both of these need to be welded together in order to give the car some rigidity. And if you remember on the last episode, we actually cut these off to fit the arches. While the arches are getting sorted, Marc goes ahead and takes off the doors, which means more Scotch-Briting for the Scotch-Brite Bandit. In order for Mario to be able to weld properly, he has to clean up the surface to make sure the metal's as bare as can be so you can get a good contact. Now to weld these two skins together, we actually used an old bonnet of a car that was crashed, so not only did we upcycle something, it cost us nothing and it's as good as any. Of course we could cover our sins because we're putting over fenders on, but because Marc's a perfectionist, we're not going to do that. With this new material welded in place, the arch is now sturdy again. Well, much sturdier than it was before, because it was a crusty mitten hole. A little bit like your mum. While Mario cleans that up, Marc starts to remove the extra hardware from the car. I saw that, Mr. Perfectionist. So I can feed my crippling Scotch-Brite addiction. At this point, with 2 weeks to go, things are starting to shape up. Hold up, wait a minute. That can't be. Yeah, it is. Oh, and by the way, with our Scotch-Brite weight reduction techniques, we also found a bunch of this inside the crash bar. Marc finally trusts me to use his power tools while he works on something that he does best. This is our cheap copy Voltex front bumper, and while we didn't have the time to film it, this has already been in the oven, and Marc started to deal with the many imperfections that this thing had. Everything to bubbles, pinholes, scratches, scuffs and dents, these all need to be dealt with, otherwise our bumper is going to look crap. Even at this stage, the bumper needs plenty of work in order to get it right. Marc wet sands all of the imperfections before he even puts a coat of primer on the thing, and that's before we've even dealt with the warping. Each section needs to be hand sanded, which can take hours for a single panel. Now you know why your local painter costs so much. Once this process is complete, you guessed it, some more sanding again. After the sanding is done, the whole thing gets degreased, and then we can move on to the next stage. Before we can even touch the car with paint, the whole thing needs to get primered. And Marc is going to start with the bumper, because despite it being one of the newest parts in the car, it's one of the worst condition parts. This is what happens with cheap fiberglass parts. It ends up costing you more in time. Now, as much as I'd love to say this is the first coat of primer and it's going to be the last, we still need to deal with all the silly little pinholes that are all over this bumper. Even after covering the whole thing in a healthy layer of primer, this is what it looks like now. Basically, anywhere you see this horrible green filler stuff is where we had a blemish that had to be dealt with. After another hour of smoothing this over, we'll come back to it later. We've got more important stuff to do. Now that the S2000 has been sanded down and degreased, it's time to put some filler on some of the damage we uncovered earlier. We of course start by filling all these dents and scratches in with some filler. We then leave it all just to set, and while we wait on that, I try and remove this tiger sealed in registration plate plinth that isn't just chemically bonded, it's also bonded with rust. While I'm doing that, Marc starts to pull some of the dents out with this trick little tool here. And finally, I managed to get this horrible UKDM plate holder out, which we'll be replacing further down the line with a nice JDM one. Disgusting. Also, some dirty criminal self-tapping screwed this fog light in. I hate you, by the way. Which then leads us to more sanding and yet more Scotch-Brite. With the filler now dry, it's down to Mario and Marc to get this all smoothed out. And after a few hours of a team effort on this stage, it brings us to one of the last ones. Degreasing the entire car to prepare it for paint. It's time to slowly reveal our choice of colour. Or moreover, the choice of colour you guys picked on YouTube. Now, looking at this workshop, you might assume that we're all some sort of professional panel beaters. But with the exception of Marc, we're just three best friends with a stupid idea. Buy a cheap crappy Honda and turn it into something that we can enjoy on the track. Mechanically, we've got a long way to go, but I think we can all agree a race car has to look cool. And of course, one of the biggest transformations you can make in a vehicle is changing its colour. It's time to roll the montage and get this thing into the booth. And with the final coat of primer, the car is ready for its final colour. For some, this will come as no surprise, but here it is. Honda's famous race car inspired Phoenix Yellow. And we don't think you guys could have picked a better colour. With all the parts finally out of paint, it's time to get this thing reassembled. As Marc begins to reassemble the car, I start to mask other areas that we're going to give some gloss black details. We have a lot of carbon parts coming for the car, and the gloss black will just help tie it all in once it's fully complete. We have a carbon fibre roof on the way, so the A-pillar will just look that much better in black. And although we've painted the bonnet yellow for now, you've guessed it, it's getting a carbon one in the future. But if we are taking it to this show, it's got to look good for now. Even the boot lid will be getting the same carbon fibre treatment, but I think you'll agree it looks pretty good in yellow. On go the doors because, you know, they're pretty important. They should do a pretty good job at keeping all of the other hairdressers away from our car. Another minor detail that makes a huge difference is our headlights. These things look absolutely horrendous, so it's time to give them a good clean, a polish, and a coat of paint on the inside. Marc starts by using a heat gun to melt the horrible gunk keeping this thing together, then pries it apart. Off comes the reflective hardware on the inside because this is the part we're going to paint. Then we decide to remove the reflector from the indicator because it just looks dated. The whole thing is of course rubbed down with Scotch-Brite, why wouldn't it be? Then the whole thing is etched with primer. On goes a healthy dose of gloss black to give these lights a more modern look. Then the lens itself is given a healthy dose of compound and a good old polish. The lights then reassembled, and I think you'll agree, they look much better than what was on before. Yet another temporary part, our back bumper goes back on, which allows us to move on to the next stage, which is getting on the over fenders. Originally for guidance, these things were just held in with self-tapping screws, but for our brand new paint finish's sake, we're going to use this double-sided 3M thick tape that should stop it from rubbing against our nice new car. To support the chemical bond, of course, we're going to go with riv nuts to hold it on mechanically. And to top it off, we have got these nice dress-up bolts that will distribute the weight to stop our carbon from getting damaged. Of course, with the front over fenders on, we need to address something that's very important, or at least should be for any car enthusiast, and that, of course, is fitment. There is now an unacceptable amount of tuck, but we've got a temporary solution for this before we get our new wheels, and that is spacers. 28mm at the front and a whopping 40mm for the rear. Once these are torqued up, they'll do for now, at least just for taking to shows. With the spacers and wheels fitted, now's a good time to test fit the bumper to make sure nothing's rubbing. And just as predicted, everything fits fine. Some of you might remember this very noisy bearing we had in the car.
That's bad for a bearing. You actually feel it.
But all thanks to the guys at Tegiwa, we managed to get this thing brand new. No more horrible bearing sound. Next we fit the gigantic spacers on the rear axle. Now we can lower the car and see our brand new stance. At some point we definitely will be lowering the car, but for now the spacers are a little bit risky, especially with that camber. While I fitted the spacers, Marc got to fitting the lights and test fitting the front splitter. And once we were all happy about how it was sitting, it got finally fixed to the bumper itself. All that was left was a couple of hours of fixing panel gaps, then a few other tedious jobs like the interior trims, then it was back into the oven to paint the A-pillar. 3 weeks, 15 KFCs, 2 solid months of editing, and hardly any sleep later. The S2000 is ready to see daylight. We've still got a long way to go with this car, and we just picked up our parts recently from Tegiwa, so we get to do the whole thing again with the underside of the car. So make sure you're following us over on Instagram and don't forget to subscribe. And we'll see you next time.